Welcome to my video assignment, Vision or Mirage, Inclusive Education in the FET sector. It must be mentioned from the outset that there is no clear definition of inclusive education. This can cause a lot of debate when it comes to inclusion, as many people question who should be included and excluded from an educational perspective. However, there is a common theme or vision running throughout multiple definitions. This assignment will examine both the international and local definitions of inclusive education. It would also investigate international policies and national policy in Ireland in relation to inclusive education and further examine inclusive education policy in the FET sector. Concepts and theories involving inclusive education will be considered using interviews from Dr. Joanna Banks on the Inclusion podcast and critically analyse some empirical questions in this research area. And finally, it will illustrate the FET sector's vision of what can and is being done to implement a more inclusive classroom. The lack of universal definition for inclusive education has created uncertainty about what inclusion is. For example, UNESCO states that inclusive education is a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of all learners through increasing participation in learning, cultures and communities, and reducing exclusion from education and from within education. This international definition of inclusive education can be taken from the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, meaning that inclusive education is for all students and to occur only within mainstream settings with all necessary adaptations and accommodations. From an Irish perspective, NCSE, which is the National Council for Special Education, described inclusion as a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of learners. It involves removing barriers so that learners will be enabled to achieve the maximum benefit from his or her schooling. Merging all three of these definitions, a clearer vision can be seen. However, looking at critical theory, we must also ask, is this a vision or a mirage? Many teachers have worked hard to ensure their classrooms are inclusive for students with disabilities, but often these initiatives were teacher-led rather than being the result of systematic change. The first framework for inclusive education was developed in 1994 at the World Conference on Special Needs Education in Salamanca. Inclusion was introduced as a promising new educational standard of approach. This was deemed to be the most important policy document on inclusive education, as this document was informed by the principle of inclusion and helped work towards a school for all approach. Following Ireland's ratification of the UN CRPD, policymakers are obliged to prevent segregation of students with additional needs. Building on the Salamanca Declaration, the global movement of education for all states that the inclusion of all children in regular schools is the most effective way to counteract discriminatory attitudes and achieve the goal of inclusive education. According to Richardson et al., in the decades since the Salamanca Declaration, inclusive education has become an intensively discussed and empirically investigated concept and a pedagogical reform project around the world. Even as an education systems differs considerably in both their classifications and inclusion rates, he states that this lack of classification and clarity makes it problematic when it comes to educational research, reforms and implementation of practices. In a published article called Inclusion at a Crossroads, experts in the field of inclusive education, Dr. Joanne Banks and Dr. Michael Shevlin, argued that inclusive education in Ireland is at a crossroads as Ireland continues to operate a parallel system of special schools and special classes for students with additional learning needs. It's interesting to examine the policy and language of the new National Further Education and Training Strategy Future, which was published on July 16, 2020. The strategy sets out a 5-year roadmap for the sector and is based around 3 key pillars of building skills, fostering inclusion, and creating pathways. It further outlines the need for appropriate provisions and the challenges facing people, in particular those with diverse needs, such as people with disabilities, new migrants, travellers, the long-term unemployed, ex-offenders, and women returners. It states that the FET system should adopt a more targeted approach to addressing barriers around participation, completion, and progression for marginalised and prioritised cohorts. The new FET strategy is implementing a partnership with community and voluntary organisations who can represent or reach out to particular groups and facilitate a pathway to re-engage with education through FE. Using Joanna Banks' Inclusion podcast to investigate empirical research further, Professor Michael Shevlin of Trinity College offers a fascinating view of policy from the Irish perspective. In his early career, Professor Shevlin was involved in creating a links programme for people with intellectual disabilities. Professor Shevlin was also involved in Trinity development of teacher education programme. He was also involved in special education report committees. He stated on the podcast that people need to be well educated in order to take up their place in life, and there is a recognition of things changing. He discussed the importance for a teacher to have empathy, generosity of spirit, communicate well, and feedback. Dr. Shevlin also emphasises that currently in the Irish education system, every single child can get an inclusive education from level 1. He also argues that the curriculum should adapt to every child entering the classroom. Professor Shevlin is an advocate for the New Brunswick model. New Brunswick in Canada is the first province to legislate for and develop a fully inclusive education system and develop best practice in the inclusion of all students in the mainstream school. In their journal article, New Brunswick Journey to Inclusive Education, ACOIN argues that in order to implement inclusive educational practices into schools, strong leadership and system-wide collaboration is required. They further state that collaborative teamwork by experienced and well-trained leaders and support staff are essential for teachers to succeed with diverse student population. However, they do point out that the New Brunswick model was 35 years in the making and is an ever-evolving. In somewhat opposing discourse about inclusive education, Dr. Gary Hornby's interview with Dr. Joanna Banks encapsulates the mixed model of education. He states in the podcast that full inclusion, with a career spanning back to the 1970s in special education and vocational training, Professor Hornby is an advocate for vocational skills to be active in the community. He stated that some children do not always benefit from academic curriculum inclusion. Instead, vocational training should be offered. Inclusion, he states, comes from theory. All means all theory. This is a simple but powerful idea, but not always right. He advocates for the mixed model theory of inclusion, which he argues is the most sensible and optimum thing to do. In the journal article titled Inclusive Special Education, Development of a New Theory for the Education of Children with Special Educational Needs and Disability, Hornby states the goal is to create a new vision which combines key aspects of inclusive education and special education in order to ensure that all children receive the best possible education and prepare for living successful and fulfilled lives after they leave school. Despite the somewhat opposing views on inclusive education, there are many recurring themes discussed by theorists, policymakers, psychologists and educators throughout the Inclusion podcast with Dr. Joanna Banks. The importance of teacher training and CPD, curriculum for all, inclusive leadership, UDL and attitudes towards disabilities are some of the recurring themes which are agreed upon by many theorists and policymakers. Considering these themes through the lens of further education, it's clear that current FET policy is implementing inclusion in its future strategy. In the introduction of the FET strategy, the current Minister for Higher and Further Education, Simon Harris, states that the breadth of provision offered through FET is as impressive as it is diverse, from community outreach programs, family learning, integration and inclusion initiatives, to traineeships and apprenticeships. FET can put you on the pathway to anywhere you want to go in education, in work and in life. It's true that the FET sector has a vast student population that present with varying different challenges. This year alone, students in my class have presented with dyslexia, general mild learning disabilities, short-term memory loss and severe anxiety and depression. There is also a cohort of students returning to education after a long absence, such as single mothers, students fleeing from war and seeking asylum, and students whereby English is not their first language. Exploring research in the area of inclusive education, Jennifer Katz states that the presence of students with disabilities does not negatively impact the learning of other students. In fact, research shows that typical students in classrooms that include students with disabilities develop stronger communication and leadership skills and have more positive attitudes towards diversity. But how do we reach all students to create an inclusive environment? The theory and practice of universal design for learning is a recognised pedagogical approach to differential learning approaches and accessibility for diverse learners. SULIS and the ETBI have combined their efforts to create a guidance document to implement universal design for learning in the FET sector. This document also gives examples of good practice that is currently being undertaken in the FET sector. Teachers are being encouraged to take part in CPD courses such as Universal Design for Learning, Digital Badge, and also take part in postgraduate studies such as Trinity College's Certificate in Inclusion and Diversity in Further Education and Training. This continued professional development in teacher education can improve knowledge and attitudes towards diversity and inclusion. As Shevlin and Banks said in Inclusion at a Crossroads, our biggest barrier can be our attitudes and assumptions around students who are perceived different from a non-existent norm. It is now time to ask the difficult question around why some students are marginalised by our education system and what we plan to do about that going forward. All play a part in improving learning for students with additional needs and continue to collaborate and network with colleagues who are experts in their fields. This is the only way we can start on the road to inclusive education. To conclude, we must take the best of all definitions of inclusive education to understand the vision of inclusive education. We must learn from the recurring themes of empirical research and look to best international practice, such as the New Brunswick model in Canada. Finally, we must continue to strive for inclusion through accessibility of the curriculum through UDL and teacher training, whilst continuing to change attitudes towards diversity in our society. Thank you for listening to my video assignment.